So we're going through the code on your end. Is there anything you didn't understand?
Not really. Everything you explained, at least for the things you explained, I understand it. Any other thing, I'm sure, is something that you're going to teach us along the way, like what I asked about the database and other and the ORM. So I'm sure we'll talk about that along the way.
Yes, it's something that we'll look at along the way. All right. I guess that's all. So if you have any question at any point during the class, you are free to drop it on the chat, and I'll do my best to go through that again. So today is our class 6, and we are going to look at path parameters, like I mentioned earlier. We are going to look at path parameters, and as you progress in the class, you really see why you really understand what these path parameters are and why they are necessary, like why they are unavoidable when you're working with APIs. To do that, I'm going to create a new project. We'll not reuse the last project, we'll create a new one. Then I'll repeat basically the same workflow that that I did last time. That's I'll create a virtual environment or activate the virtual environment, and I'll install Fast API again, and we'll work with that fresh.
All right, so we can't see your screen yet.
Oh. Sorry about that. Okay, I believe you can see it now.
Yes, I can see it now.
So I'm going to create a new folder for class 6. So using the bash, the Linux command line, you create folders with make that command, make directory. It's a short form for make directory. So make dir class 6. So with that we have class 6. So I'll then go into that class 6 with cd. cd means change directory. That you are moving directory from your current directory to whatever directory you want to go into. So I want to go into the class 6 directory. So that was the cd class 6. Right? So class 6 is currently empty. I'm going to first create a virtual environment. And like we did in the last class, it is Python 3 minus m v and d. Of course, this last v and v is the name you want to call your virtual environment, right? I wish to call it v and v, but you can call it anything. Okay, so we are waiting for the virtual environment to be created.
Okay.
All right, the creation is done. So after creating these virtual environments, you need to actually activate it. You need to actually activate the environment, and we do that with source v and v activate. And I explained this in the last class that we are basically calling this is a v file. We are going into this v file, and we are going to the bin folder. Okay, sorry, the v folder. That's a virtual environment. Then we are going to the bin folder, and then we are executing this activate command. All right. So when you do that, the virtual environment is activated. As you can see here, we have the v and the inclusive parentheses. That shows that it is activated. And if you wish to deactivate it, you just need to type deactivate in your terminal and it will be deactivated. All right. So with this, we are ready to install Fast API. And you do that with pip install. Pip install Fast API. And I don't just want to install Fast API. I want to install Fast API with all everything it needs to run, like the Uvicon server, like Pydantic and the rest of that. We've not really looked at Pydantic yet, but as the class progresses, that should be in the next class. Yeah, we'll look at that. So since we want to install Fast API with all its dependencies, I will add this alt tab and click enter. So this Fast API will be downloaded from PIP and it will be installed into this virtual environment. I think that should take a few seconds, so I'll pause for it to complete. Okay, we are done installing the Fast API, and the next step is to create the file that we want to work with, and I want to call this file. Last class file was based up by, but you can call it anything. Maybe let me call it server.py. So I will touch server.py. So this touch command is a command that you use to create a file. That's using the bash command line, the Linux command line. You use touch to create a file. So why am I saying this? Like, when you are actually interacting with server, like the server environment, and most of these server environments are usually in Linux. Like, I'm referring to things like VPS, right? If you need to deploy your API to the cloud, most of the times you need to understand you need to understand how to work with the Linux command line, because the OS there is usually Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is Linux, and the server environment doesn't have a CLI, like a GUI. I mean, there's a graphical user interface that you can click on. So you should be comfortable working with the command line actually. So we touch server.py. We've created a file called server.py, and we'll be using this file to build our code, all right, to do everything we need to do in today's class. So the very first thing that we are going to do is that just like every Fast API project, and just like what we did in the last class, we need to import this Fast API class from the Fast API library that we installed a few minutes ago. And you do that with from Fast API import Fast API. So with this, we've imported the Fast API class, and we need to instantiate this class. And we instantiate with app is equal to this Fast API that we imported. And please note, this doesn't have to be called app. Right? It can be called anything. Right? It doesn't need to be called app. I'm just using the word app. You can call it anything. So I'm going to create one endpoint, and for now it will be a normal endpoint, just like what we did in the last class. I will not introduce the path parameters yet. So that will be app.get. I want it to be a getting point, and I want the path to be items. Right. I want the path to be items. Then when a request comes to this endpoint, I want this particular function to be executed. Read item. And for now, it should return hello. Return hello world. So we can run this particular file we can run this server with this particular command. If you go to the README for class 5, at line 15, that's the 3, you can see the command that you use to run a fast API server, and it is uvicon base app then reload to make automatic reloads whenever you make changes to the server. And we are not going to use this exact command in this case because of one thing. Please note that in class 5, the file that we were working with, all right, was called base. That is why we used base here, right? Then this app is actually this app, right? So in the context of this class, the command will be, instead of this base, because the file we are working with is not base, it is called server. We are going to replace this base with server. So I'll copy that. Okay, let me type it out. To be uvicon server app reload. All right, so we now have a server running at port 8000. So it's localhost running on the local host at port 8000. So you can choose to open this on your browser, or you can choose to use the request clients like Postman or Insomnia. So at first, I'll open it with my browser. Okay, so that's my browser. And don't forget that the path that this particular function executes is at /items. All right, so if you click enter, we can see the data that is expected. Right, it is hello world. And you can choose to look at the docs. So when you go to the docs, you see the list of endpoints that we currently have, and the only one is items, and it returns a 200 response when it's successful, and the response type is basically a string. So I guess I'll pause here for questions before we proceed. Is any question so far?
Okay, one thing I'm curious, I don't know if it makes sense. Like, is it possible to like create multiple will I say HTTP method, so or multiple methods, like for example, this get you just created, is it possible to like create another get, so having two get methods maybe for different purpose, or does it make sense, or must it always be one for each HTTP request?
Okay, you mean you're asking if it's possible to
So to like
create
this, yeah, like this get you
that,
created now, maybe create another get again, maybe for to return a different thing or for a different purpose. I don't know.
okay, do you mean something like this?
Yes,
Maybe
yes,
return
exactly.
hello world one?
Yes.
Okay, no, it will not work. It will not work. I think only this first one will be returned, but let us see. Let me
All
open my
right.
test lines and experiment with that.
Okay.
Okay, so while my test client is loading, let's use the browser instead to save time.
All right.
Okay. And this is that time to event. All right, so like I had said earlier, it will not work because in this case, as you can see, we had two endpoints, right? And the two endpoints are on the same path, and they are accepting the same request. That's the same GET request. Then the first one, that's the one higher on the queue, returned hello world, while the one lower on the queue returned hello world one. So in this kind of case, the first is the first endpoint that will be returned, not the last endpoint. But let us see what
Okay.
happens if it is a post request.
Okay.
So let me convert this GET request to a post and see what happens. Right. The first one is get to the items part, which returns hello world, and the second one is post to that items part, which should return hello world one. Right. So let me switch to my test lines and we will experiment with that. All right. So I want this to be a post request, and this post request should go to the items. Well, let's see. Good. Hello world one. As you can see, it's as you can see, it is returned. So what this means is that so what this means is that if you have two endpoints, right, two endpoints with the same path, you can and they do different things, all right. You cannot use the same HTTP bus to interact with both of them, right? So if the first one accepts a GET request and the second one accepts a GET request, only the first one will be considered when a request comes there. Only the first one will be considered. But let's say if you really need to perform another operation on that same path, all right, you should decorate it with a different kind of HTTP verb. Right? If the first one is get, the second one has to be something else like post or maybe put or maybe delete.
Okay.
Okay, please. Is there any other question apart from that?
Okay. Okay. That means if I'm correct, I don't know, maybe it's still beyond the scope of this. So let's say, just like you said, we can't create multiple endpoints on the same path. But what if maybe they are different paths? So maybe like a get request now, you are trying to get from a database. Let's say in a normal scenario, you already have a database where there's record stored, and you are trying to read from the data from the database. So maybe if you have a multiple, let's say 2 databases, those 2 databases maybe may have multiple different paths, each of them. So ideally, would it make sense to like maybe have different, so one get request for a particular database path, then another get request for another database path, maybe something like that? I don't know.
Sorry, I don't really get you. You mean these 2 get requests, are they,
Yeah.
do you mean if they are
Yes.
going to the same path?
No, a
Like
different path.
items. Okay, yes, definitely. For example, we can have another get request here. Let's say this is going to a part like me, right? It will still work. The first one is the part is different, all right? This one is items, and the second one is me, all right? It will still work because they are different parts entirely. It will still work. So you can perform one operation here, perform a different operation here. But if the parts are the same, like they are the exact same, like items, this will not work. All right. Only the one higher up in the list, higher up in the file will be executed. And the one down in the file will be ignored unless it is working with a different HTTP file. I hope,
Okay.
does that answer your question, please?
Yes, perfectly. Yes.
Okay. It's okay. Please, is there any other question from any member of the class? Okay, let me check the chat if there's anything. Okay, nothing. All right, that's fine. So now that we know the real basics, all right, we know the real basics of these parts and all of that, we're going to look at a different concept, and it is called path parameters. Like, for example, let's assume we have a database. For now, let me shut down this over. I'll spin it up later. So let's assume we have a database. All right, this is not the real database. It's just an in-memory database. So let's say we have a database, and I'll call this database DB. And this DB is equal to, it contains a list of items, all right? And I wish to store the details of the members of this class in this DB. So let's assume we have something like this. Let's say this is the first student, and the first student has a name of the first student has a name of what was the name? Okay, the name of Uche. Then an address of, let's say, Lagos. Let's tell me that for now. Then we have other data in the database. Let's assume we have other data in the database. The second member of the class is Matthew, which also stays at Lagos, and the third member of the class is let's say IDT. which stays at Abuja. All right, so EU, let's just assume that this is our normal database, but of course it is not. It's just an in-memory list that we are storing dictionaries in. Okay, so if we need to get a particular item from this list, or what if we want to modify these endpoints, these items endpoints, so that it will return an item from this list? How would we do it? Right? How do we do it?
Okay. I don't really know yet, because I know, like, based on the research I've made before now, I know ideally when you are creating, like before, when you are using a post request, normally a post request adds a kind of number, a kind of a unique ID. So starting from 1 or 1, 2, 3, so that it identifies it. So you should be able to return each item based on the unique ID. But right now, I don't know how, except maybe you add a unique identifier for each of the items on the list.
Yes. That's a perfect suggestion. So the thing is, we'll get to that at some point. For now, I want to explain why these part parameters are really necessary, right? So if you want to maybe get a data from the front end, right, or from the client that is interacting with your database, another option, another way, one of the ways in which you can use to get this data is through part parameters, right? These are values, right? These are values that you can pass to the part and it will be captured on the back end, right? So let's say I want to capture one of the names in this database, and maybe I want to capture the first name, all right, the first name of, maybe the first item within this database. That would be something like maybe return DB. That is the name of a database, which is a list. All right. So when you want to get a particular item from the list, you index it, right? So list index starts from 0. So the first item of a list is at index 0. The second item of that list is at index 1. And the third item is at index 2. All right. So let's say I want to get the very first item that's of that particular list. I can say that I just want to return the first item, which is name, Uche, and address Lagos to the front end. All right. So let's look at this. If it will work. Okay. Okay, so get request. So I'm going to take post request. Good. Sorry, let me share my test plan. Okay, so I'll send this request to that particular endpoint and see the response. As you can see, we now have hello. Instead of that word, we are returning that first item of the list. Okay, do you have any question on this? Like for now, do you have any question concerning this?
Okay, for me, no questions.
Okay, I think you are actually the only one speaking in this class. Uche, that's you, right? So Matthew
Hello,
and
yes, that's me,
IDD.
Uche.
Okay, Matthew and IDD, do you have any question? It's all right. I'll assume that they have no question. Okay, so right now we are returning a static data. all right, we are defining the exact index that we want the endpoints to return to the front end. Right? So what if we want to give the front end that leeway, right, to determine the kind of data it wants to get from the database, right? Let's say if I were to, if let's say I have a database of so many users and I'm creating one endpoint per user, Let's say if I have 100 users and I create 100 endpoints so that if a user wants to get this kind of data to query that specific endpoint, it will not really make a lot of sense, right? So instead, it makes more sense to create a generic endpoint that takes in the index that this front end wants. So instead of we entering just this zero, right? Instead of we entering just this zero, we can define the index as a path parameter, right? So that's where the path parameter comes in. You can define that index so that the front end can then enter the index that they want, right? Which index do you want to get this data? And we will capture that index that was supplied to the path, then use that index to query the database and then return that data to the front end. So that's why path parameters are useful. So we create path parameters using the normal Python f strings. There's what they call f strings in Python. Maybe at the end of the class I'll link a README. Okay, I'll link a URL in the class README so that at the end of the class you can go and read more about the strings. So we can actually use that syntax. Can you see these two curly braces?
Yes, I can see.
These two curly braces on the path specifies that this data, right? This data is not static, right? This data can change. It depends on what is entered on the front end. Okay, so we can get an index value at this point and pass in that index value. Okay, so we can get an index value at this point, and we will not just pass in that index value, right? We are going to define that exact word we used, right, as an argument for our function. So in this case, we are going to define index here. All right. So when we do this, Fast API will know. Fast API will understand that when anything comes in after these items, all right, that is the index. It will then pass down the index to you, and you can then use that index to query the database. So let us test this if it works. I'm going to switch back to my test client. And we now have the path, which is items. So we are going to enter the index that we want, right? So I'll enter 0 and let us see. Okay, I didn't start the server, sorry about that. So we need to start the server with Vicon server up reload. So that we can then switch to our test client and execute the request. Internal server error. Why are we having an internal server error? Let's check.
Okay, and that place you define the index inside the get method bracket. You said it's an f string. I thought f string is supposed to have f before the quotes.
Oh. Yes. F strings like normal Python F strings are supposed to have are supposed to have S before the code, but Fast API does that for us under the hood. So for this particular part that we are working with, you don't need to put that F.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Good. So we had an internal server error, and we need to understand how this error came about. And as you can see, we have a type error that lists indices must be integers or slices, not string. All right. I think that 0 we entered there. When it came down here, Fast API thought or assumed that it is a string. All right. So we need to directly specify that this data we are getting here, we want it to be an int. We expect it to be an int. So with that, you can actually define types, Python types with these part parameters. So in this case, I'll put in a colon and then indicate the type that I expect to get from that front end. All right. In this case, we want to get an int, that's an integer, not a string. We want an int. So we are going to specify there that what we need is an int. Okay. So let's switch to the test clients and let's test that. Can you see the clients now?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Let's test that and see if it works. Okay, as you can see, the error is no longer there. Right? The data that we expected has been returned. So we now have the leeway to enter anything we want. We can get the first, we can get the second item with an index of 1, right? It has returned Matthew, the address of Lagos. We can get the last item with the index of 2, and it will return IDD, which stays at Abuja, right? Then, would this work?
No, it shouldn't, because there's not, we don't have up to 5 items on the list.
Perfect. I don't expect it to work. So we have an internal server error. So that is it. So normally in your production server, that's the project that you are deploying to the world. All right, you will not do this. There will be checks in place. There will be checks in place. Maybe you can write a code that checks the if the item that is returned, okay, if your list has the capacity to return the item that we get from the front end. So that's what you do in a normal REST API. So for this, I'm just using it to show you how the whole thing works, how you can work with path parameters. Then we've also looked at how you can define the types, right? How you can define the types of what you get from the front end. And another thing that we can look at is that you can actually convert, right? You can actually convert whatever is returned, like from the front end, right? Say for example, something like this. Let me start the server again. Let's say I convert this to, let's say I make this a string instead of an int. Okay. Then you just want to return that index. Okay. So this is what I was trying to explain. You can actually perform data conversion, all right, on the server. Right. For example, let me switch back to the test client. Can you see what we have here? This index we have here, it is an int, right? It is actually an
Yes.
int, but don't forget that our server, don't forget that our server is accepting a string, right? But we are sending an int. Okay. So when the data comes to this point, the server will then translate this data from that integer that it was to a string and then return that string because you're returning hello and that particular index. So if we actually query this endpoint, if we actually query this endpoint, you will see that despite the fact that we entered an int into the path, we are getting back a string.
Yeah.
Okay, please, do you have any question on that before we proceed? I think let me
Okay.
pause for questions.
Okay. No question. I think I get. So because you made it a string, so it is returning that exact string. It's no longer identifying the dictionary you created.
Yes, definitely. Please, does anyone else have a question? Okay. All right. So the next thing we are going to look at is validation. All right. So in this case, you can see that our endpoint actually receives um, it's we have specified that we want to receive a path parameter. So what happens if this path parameter is not attached to the request? Right. That's a good question. What happens if this path parameter is not attached to the request? So let's see. Items title not found.
Okay, we didn't specify any item for it to
Yes,
bring.
yes. So um, we need to understand what really happens we don't if we don't get the parameter that we are actually looking for. Can you see my VS Code?
Yes, I can see your VS Code.
All right. So let's return that index and see. Good. It returns 404, meaning this endpoint is not found. Error. Still, this endpoint is not found. Session 6. Hello, 6. All right. So if you don't provide the kind of data that it is expecting, of course, since that endpoint does not exist, what I mean is, let me go back to my VS Code. What I mean is, if you don't provide this index, right? If you don't provide this, it will look for an endpoint that has only this, which we do not have in this project at this point. That's why it is returning a 404 error, meaning that this particular endpoint does not exist.
Okay.
Did you understand that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I understand.
All right. So now let's go and look at the documentation. Here is the API documentation and check out how it looks like when you're working with path parameters. Good. So can you see this index? You know,
Yes, I can see.
yeah, the parameter that we are getting, right, is also automatically generated for us here, so that anyone that is going through the API documentation will then see that, okay, this particular value within the curly braces is uh, is the parameter that the front end that the API actually expects from the front end. And if you come down a little bit, we get more details. All right, we are told here that this parameter has to be an integer and that it is required. So let's try it out. You can enter any number, then maybe 87, and check it out. All right, so this is our response. It returns hello, 87.
Okay.
All right. Is there any question on that?
No question for now, no.
Okay.
So, but right now, if you impute, let's say 3 or 2 or 1, will it go to the dictionary? Will it return something from that dictionary?
Okay, I edited the code. If you look at it properly,
Okay.
you know, as you can see, I edited the code, so it did not. I stopped it from returning something from that dictionary. What it does now
Okay.
is it just returns whatever data that you sent to it.
Okay, I get, yes.
Okay, so it just returns that data. All right, then there is one more thing. All right, there's one more thing. So what if you wanted to have maybe two endpoints that are of this structure? Maybe something like app.get, and we have items and me, right? And I want to return I just want to return a normal response. So would this work?
I get, since they have different parts, yes, it should.
Okay, let us see if it works. So we have items. It works. Yeah, sure, it does. So you have that like you have that leeway to define any endpoint you want, as long as they are fundamentally different, right? As long as they are fundamentally different. But if we were to collect this exact index and then maybe return something else, it will work with only the first endpoint. I mean, the endpoint that is higher up in the list, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that is that with the path parameters. Please. Do you have any question on that? Any questions so
Okay.
far on pod parameters?
No questions so far. I think I understand everything you said.
Okay. Now, when you're working with API, sometimes you need to use something else that is called query parameters. Okay, now let me share my screen. So, sometimes you need to use a query parameter, and query parameters looks like this. Maybe after writing your part, you will input a question mark, and then maybe you can say like name is equal to anything. Maybe like name is equal to anything. There are situations in which you will need to do something like this, right? Maybe if you want to send the users, okay, if you want to capture the user's authentication token, the user can attach it as a query parameter, all right? It works basically the same thing as a path parameter, okay? They are basically used to pass data from the clients to the API, that's to the endpoints that you are working on. So in this case, how do we actually capture that query parameter? Do you have any idea?
Okay. If I got you right, like you said this query parameter. So is it like a way of, let's say, making the request from the browser, from the URL where you type the URL?
Yes, yes, you can do it with your browser. You can do it with your test line.
Okay.
Yeah, you can use your browser. You can use your test line.
Okay. All right. Go ahead. I don't know how.
Okay. So what I need is I want to I want a situation in which the back end, all right, our endpoints will be able to capture whatever value we enter to this particular query parameter, right? So to do that, you will actually, let me change my screen to my VS Code. Right, to do that, you just need to declare the name of whatever query parameter you want to capture, right? So in this case, you want to capture any query parameter that is called name, right? So, and I want it to be a string. Now, instead of returning just hello world, I want it to return hello name.
Okay, I get.
Yes, yes, yeah. Instead of returning hello world, I want it to return hello name. So you can do that with this. It should work, right? We have hello backslash, remove the slash. Go to this. Okay, so let's first print the name. See what happens. All right. So let me switch back to my VS Code. All right. So as you can see here, we can actually capture that value. All right. So the query parameter what I wanted to take is called name. All right. So you just need to put in that name, that query parameter name, as an argument to the function that you are working with. All right. So with that, you can then interact with this function on your Python code, do anything with it, maybe query a database with it, maybe process data with it, or filter something with it. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Do
Yeah.
you understand that? All right.
Yes, I understand.
So
Yes.
yes, initially we were working with name is equal to me. So let me change that to something else so that you can easily compare. Okay, so what if it is something like Python class? So let us see if it was captured. All right, so as you can see here, it has captured that particular value we sent to it from the front end. So it captured the value of the name, which in this case was my Python class. Sorry, I intended to type Python instead.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. All right, so we now have the Python. We now have what we expected to it, which is the Python class. So please, any question on that so far?
No question from my end. No.
Okay. So to recap, what we've done so far, we first looked at path parameters, right? Working with path parameters, and uh, these are there's the path parameter and the query parameter. They are just ways of you getting data from the front end or from anyone that is interacting with your API. And let's say if you want to maybe return the details of a particular user, right? The client can send the request and then append the ID of that user to the path. Then from your back end, you can then capture this path and then work with it. Then we also have another method of doing that. Instead of using path parameters, you can choose to use query parameters. Right? They basically do the same thing. All of them do the same thing. You can also get an integer instead of an int from the query parameter, make queries from the database, etc., etc. Okay, so finally, we are going to look at what would happen if, let us say, this query parameter is not provided. What would happen? That's a good question. What would happen if the query parameter is not provided? So let's try sending this request again, but this time without inputting that query parameter. Okay, Mike just joined us. Sorry about that. Yeah, sure, you've missed a lot. Maybe later on you can look it up on YouTube. So I was asking what would happen if we actually don't provide this query parameter. Let us see. Yes, can you see this?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes. It gives us an error. Not really an error, Sha. It gives us a validation warning that, hey, this field is required and you have not provided it. Right? The field of name, which is a query parameter, is required. We need it at that endpoint, and the user or the person that is interacting with the client has not provided it. All right. So what if you don't want this kind of error to be displayed? Let's say we want to provide a default value. If the user doesn't enter that parameter, the default value will be used. In that case, you simply add is equal to, and then input anything you want to input here. Let's say default. Let's say our default query parameter name here is default. So with this, we
I'm not
should not
seeing
have
the
this.
VS Code.
Oh, sorry, I didn't share it. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the change that I made. Let me delete it.
Okay.
Yeah. So currently, when we make requests to this particular endpoint with the query parameter, it works very well. The query parameter is printed. It works perfectly. So now the question is, what would happen if this query parameter is not there? What if it is what if it is optional, right? It's something that is optional. The user is free to provide this data or can leave the data, right? So instead of returning that error, there's a way of setting, there's a way you can actually set a default value so that if the user has not provided this particular value, this default will be set for you and you'll be able to do something with it. So let us call this default, and let us work with that. Let's see what would happen if we actually send the request to the endpoint. Send. Good. Can you see what we have here?
Yes. Hello default.
Yes. The hello default is returned, and on our server, the default value is also printed for us. That default value is also printed for us. So this is also another way of like working with this. So now, if we don't want an int to be a default value, all right? What if we want this name to be set as none? Like we don't want the default to be there. We want it to be none if the user doesn't set it. You can make use of another thing that is called optional. Another class that is called optional, and we import that from typing. Import from typing import optional. So when you come to your endpoint, we can then wrap this string. Can you see this string?
Yes.
Yes. We are the way it is now. We are telling Fast API to make sure that this user always returns a string. So if you don't want to do it that way, you can tell Fast API to make this particular place optional, to make this particular value optional. That is why we need to import this optional from the typings library, right? So if you wrap this string with that optional, it will make this particular name optional. And if the user does not give us that name, all right, none will be returned. None will be returned. So the first thing return something else like okay. And let us just print first and see what happens. So I'll now switch back to my test client and I will execute the request again. So field is required. Why is it so? It's supposed to okay. Optional string. Okay. All right. So okay, let me switch back to my VS Code. I need to share something.
All right.
All right. So initially, I didn't have this. I didn't have this optional. Okay, I didn't have this is equal to none. Right. We just had optional string. All right. So even though this basically tells fast API to make this particular value optional, but we need a default value. All right. So that is why you saw that particular error. That's why you saw that particular validation error. So if we want none to be returned, if this particular value is not provided, you can use this particular syntax optional, the kind of data that you are expecting. And if this data is not required, okay, if this data is not provided, you want the default to be set to none. So if we should execute this request now, we should have none printed on our terminal. Like this. Can you see the none? Then
Yes.
yeah, then if we should actually provide a value, that instead of using none, if we actually provide a value, the value will be printed instead of the none. So let's try that again. Let's say name is equal to this name. So as you can see, we now have a value, right? So if the user sends something, we will capture that. But if nothing is sent, instead of actually returning an error, or instead of returning a validation error, right, we can then assign none to it and work with that. Is any question so far?
No question, no. I understand.
Okay. Mike, you came late. Any question? Mike, any question? Okay. I assume that there's no question from Mike. Okay, he has dropped something. Let me check. All right. No. Okay, I get it. So no question from Mike either. So this is what will happen. So far today we've learned the basics, like everything you need to know about path parameters and query parameters, right? These are like let's say 90% of all the situations you will encounter involving path and query parameters is what we have touched here, right? But there are some other cases that we have not looked at, most specifically parameters that accept enums, right? Parameters that accept enums. So I will refer you to the documentation. I'll refer you to the documentation so that you can go through this. Let me share my screen. Can you see my browser?
Yes, I can see your brother.
Okay. So the first API docs is at fastapi.tiangolo.com. So you go to the docs, then navigate to the tutorial, this user guide, right? Click it. And the first one is intro. We have first steps, then we have path parameters. You can click on it. So here, the whole concept of path parameters is explained. everything you need to know is explained at this point. Then, as for the query parameters, what I summarized is also here in more detail. So what I would recommend is maybe during your free time, or during your free time, you can try and go through this. You can try and go through this. Then if you have any question, like if there's anything you don't understand, if there's any challenge you come across, you are always free to send me a message in Slack, and I'll be very, very, very happy to explain it again to you and help you resolve the issue. So the most important thing about development is that you should be able to make research. That's really how to learn. The You can't really depend on your teacher to show you everything, because your teacher will not be able to do that due to the time available. He will not be able to do that. So the most important thing, and what I love doing, is that I will do as much as possible to, as we are learning, I'll point you to the right resources. If we are using a particular library, I'll point you to that library. Okay. If we are using a particular piece of code that is available on a public repo, I'll point you to the documentation so that you can easily, if you are stuck, if you have any error while you are working with it, you can always go there and get a result. So that is it. Go to fastapi.tiangulo.com and first open the user guide. Go to path parameters. It goes in greater detail. Everything we've learned in today's class about path parameters, and the query parameters does the same thing too. So that is that. So before we close for the day, do we have any question on that?
Did I see?
Which any questions?
So for me, no question so far. No, I get everything you have said.
Okay, it's okay. And for mine too, I believe there is no question from his end as well. So before we go, I would still like to reiterate that you should, I'll push this code to GitHub, and you can clone it from there. Okay, you can fetch it from there and run the code locally. And if you should have any errors, if you should have any issues, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me on Slack, and I'll be very, very, very happy to point in the right direction. So that will be all for today's class. Then from next class, we are going to look at request body. Okay. Today's class was, we were looking into how you can get data from your clients using path parameters and query parameters. There is another way of getting data from the clients, a more popular way. All right, a more popular way. Most of the endpoints that you are going to work with will at least make use of something like that. All right, request body. You attach whatever data that you want to attach to the back end, to the request body, and then send it over there. Right. So that's what we are going to look at in the next class. Then we are going to look at another library that is called Pydantic. Pydantic. It's spelled as Pydantic. It is a library that is used for data validation in Fast API. You use it to specify the kind of data you want to get from the front end, the kind of data that you want to return to the front end, and also validate the data that you get from the front end. What I mean is, let's say you have, okay, let me use the project that we'll be working on in the next few classes. The mini Twitter backend that I spoke about. For example, when a user wants to create an account, right? We can maybe make a requirement that the minimum length of the password should be at least 6 characters. All right. So you do that with Pydantic. That's the validation that we are talking about. So when this data comes from the front end, if this data doesn't meet that validation requirement, it will be rejected. Okay, so we are going to look at all of that in the next class. As for now, that will be all for today.
All right. Thank you very much,
So
sir.
thanks so much for
Yeah, thank you so much.
it. And